as your interim dean.
Hi, Elizabeth. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You're here.
Thank you for the invitation.
You
I really
bet.
appreciate
I'm
it.
happy you're here. When did you get here?
Last night.
Okay.
Yeah, just went through the kind of climate withdrawal, and then I'm good.
And then here
just,
you are.
Yeah, it's like bringing home a goldfish. Just had to put me in the transition tank for a little
There you
while, and
go.
now I'm feeling fine.
Yes, we worked on that this afternoon.
That was the project. Yes,
Do you
it was
go back
immersion.
into the transition tank when you go home?
I will need to. Yes, that they call that transition tank an airport now. Very complicated, but yes.
That's right. Well, are you going to stay for a couple of days? Or do you have to go right
Unfortunately, it's the teaching term. It's horrible, and it's like, and a Monday talk actually works, but I have a full day of studio teaching tomorrow, and I'm coordinating first year and all these other academic life blah blahs. So yeah. So but it's I know I love to turn these kind of adventures into more than what they could be.
But they never work out.
And yeah, sometimes
I always
you
say I
plan.
will, and I never do because
Yes.
it never works out.
I know. I tried. This one, I was like, could I make it more?
Come back sometime when you're not.
I would love to do that. I would love to do that. I totally agree. That was. I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina originally, so I'm used to the idea of being in a bubble within a state that has another interest. So I'm used to that bubble idea.
Yeah, nice.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad
Great.
you're here.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation. Yes.
I was going to say hello, Kevin Alter.
Hi, Kevin. Very nice to meet you. I just walked by your office. I hear this morning.
Okay.
Well, I was up looking for a coffee, and I looked and I was like, that looks like an architect's office. So I asked Igor, and he's like, that's Kevin Alter's office. I was like, okay, cool.
It's we've only been there about a year, but we're pretty happy.
It looks
there.
like a nice gig. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
Cool.
So you teach with Robert, right? Robert Levin?
Love it. Yeah, absolutely.
Old
Yes.
friend. He's
Oh, really?
awesome
Where do you know
friend,
him
yeah.
from?
Well, we actually grew up in the same town, but we didn't know each other.
Too
He
funny.
was finishing graduate school. I was just
Which
coming
town
in.
would that have been? So I can tease him about it.
Larchmont, New York.
Okay. I know what.
He's, I knew him a little bit in graduate school because we overlapped just a little bit, but he's a pretty brilliant guy.
He is. He's a sharp guy. Great to have on crits and always entertaining.
Yeah, sure.
Always has a
Please say hello
thought.
from me.
I will give him your best.
How long
yeah.
are you in town for?
It's a short visit because it's a teaching term, so I actually got to teach tomorrow. So I'm on a kind of an early morning flight back, and I could have budgeted a weekend here, but my kids had some things, and anyway, they're just like,
little one too,
you know
so
how this goes.
I know.
So unfortunately, it's shorter than I wanted it
I've
to be.
admired it from afar, so
Oh my
I'm
gosh,
excited
that's
to
very
see.
nice. Thank you so much.
We'll get started. I mean, people
Sure.
are still coming in.
Yeah.
But maybe I'll do the introduction.
It's all good.
and,
Yeah, and generally, I mean, I have like ways that I can talk more quickly about things and shorter things. Like, should I be wrapping up around a little bit after 6, kind of like
So,
6:10? Because I
basically-
don't want to like lull people. I mean, I'll keep an eye. I'm okay to always
some
adjust.
classes meet at 6.
Oh my. So you might see a departure.
People start getting up. It's not because they're not liking your talk. It's
Okay.
because they're trying to get to the next class.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Unfortunately. So you don't have to rush.
Right.
But just so that you know,
If they see
I'm glad
people
you
drift
asked.
away.
It's not because they're bored by your
Okay.
lecture. They're loving it, but they have to go to class.
That's cool.
So I think like 50 minutes would be great.
Sorry.
50
Yeah.
minutes would be great. And then
50,
we'll take it.
yeah.
50. Yeah, not
Yeah.
15. Yeah, 50. Just so that like with questions, it's a
Yeah.
little bit over.
It's
an hour.
healthy. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
yeah.
So we're cool. I'll do that. I'll keep a clock next to me.
I think you will be
myself
more
accountable.
comfortable if you wrap up right before 6.
Yes.
So if people have to go, they can leave during questions.
That's a good call. Okay,
You know
I
what I
will
mean?
do some things. Then at some point you might see me do a bit of a kind of blah 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 rapid fire.
Yeah.
You get the gist kind of
Yeah,
thing.
that's
Okay.
totally fine. Okay. So I realize that people are still trickling in after studio, but we'll try to get started just to make good use of our time. Good evening, everyone. I'm Igor Siddiqui, Associate Professor and Chair of Lectures and Exhibitions. This evening's speaker is Mason White. Mason comes to us from the Toronto-based practice Lateral Office, where he's a founding partner. Lateral Office, founded in 2003 with Lola Shepard, is an experimental design practice that operates at the intersection of architecture, landscape, and urbanism. The studio describes its practice process as a commitment to, quote, design as a research vehicle to pose and respond to complex, urgent questions in the built environment, engaging in the wider context and climate of a project, including social, ecological, or political conditions. The Lateral Office has been recognized with several awards and merits, including, there are many, many things, a 2016 National Urban Design Award, a 2013 Progressive Architecture Award, a 2011 Paulson's Foundation for Sustainable Construction Gold Award, a 2011 Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York, and you get the picture. You do a lot. The firm was selected to represent Canada with Arctic adaptations at the 2014 Venice Biennale in Architecture, where they received special mention, a first for Canada at the Architecture Biennale. And in 2015, the firm was the only Canadian participant at the inaugural Chicago Architecture Biennial. And I believe that the second Chicago Biennial just announced their participants for next year. Mason White is also an associate professor at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. He studied at Virginia Tech and Harvard Graduate School of Design. He has taught at Harvard, Cornell, Ohio State, and UC Berkeley. White previously worked at a number of distinguished firms, including Copeland & Fox, Machado Silvetti Associates, and Panter Hudspith in London, before forming Lateral Office. Mason is convinced that there are new roles for architecture that have yet to be explored because we're not really looking. Please join me in welcoming Mason White.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction, Igor. We realized we have known each other 20 years now, which is not a good way to feel young again when you use words like 20, but it's... Okay, yeah, let's just say. We used to play in the sandbox in New York. It's a pleasure to be here. I was just saying that I'm still sort of adjusting to the climate here, so apologize if I break a sweat randomly here. I'll try not to, though. Us Canadians are still adjusting. And actually, I'm a dual citizen, and I've sort of, I'd say a sort of adopted Canadian in the sense that I've really enjoyed coming to know my new country. And I always enjoy coming back home to the States as well. And I feel like I have a kind of fresh perspective on both kind of national identities, which has, I found very fruitful, both to practice, but also just on a more personal level. So I titled the talk today, Architecture, Environment, Action, 5 points on a new collectivity. A little bit of a mouthful. I'm a bit of a fan of both titles and subtitles, so so I was trying to figure out ways to get a lot of different ideas in there. I also quite like, as you can see by the title itself, I quite like word, I guess, frictions of words in terms of contemplating new possibilities for the discipline. So I find it really exciting to associate architecture, environment, and the word action together as one, and to think that that itself might be a kind of practice, that might be, let's say, like a position statement or a manifesto for what architecture can do or should do. So I'll try to unpack some of that. And then I called it 5 points on a new collectivity because this is an area I've gotten increasingly interested in, is that design, regardless of its disciplinary attachment, architecture, landscape architecture, or urban design, or planning and many others, or even at smaller scales, they're really always influencing how people behave and how collectives gather or how people form collectivities. So that's become a real kind of subversive interest that has risen up in the work that we've now self-identified almost by looking back at projects that we do. This is myself and my partner Lola Shepard in our pretty smallish studio. We've got 6 workstations. We've maxed out ever at, I think, 7 people. We tend to have 2 or 3 people working with us full-time, and maybe sometimes 1 person with us part-time, depending upon whether it's an internship and so forth. We actually rent out of a collective studio that has a lighting designer, 2 graphic designers, and a larger architectural practice in it. So we sort of benefit from the collectivity of a printer and a coffee machine and other sort of things that one often gathers around. So it's we've got 2 windows. You can see some light coming out from one of our windows. It's a pretty modest studio space. As I said, I'm pretty interested in, or our practice is quite interested in this idea of environment. So I'm going to just do that classic thing of bring up some definitions, because I find this to be a useful way to just orient ourselves within this concept. So this is the dictionary definition according to Merriam-Webster of environment. It gives these 5 different definitions. So if we look at 2 of them in particular, they seem to refer to ideas of site and context. It says an environment is the surroundings of and influences on a particular item of interest, which you could say is fantastic for designers to think of that. Or number 4, it says a particular political or social setting, arena, or condition as an environment. If we look at it another way, this third, probably for me the most provocative definition of environment doesn't really take that traditional track, but describes it as something that's all of the elements over which a designer has no control and that affect a system or its inputs and outputs, which is probably somewhat terrifying to think of, things that are out of your control. But it's almost starting to describe the things around design in an interesting way. It's saying that there are these other things around what it is that you do that are out of your control. And I think that's a really interesting schism to see, is that it's both describing the surroundings, but then it's also saying that there are these elements outside of your control that may or may not be influencing or affecting a system. So maybe some questions to all of us today, could be, what are architecture's new environments, maybe after conventional notions of sustainability? Or what new synthetic relationships can appear from design, environment, and collectivity at once? What kind of typologies, what kind of design platforms exist out there? So I'm going to show you 5 projects that respond to these ideas of collectivity. And I've structured them actually around a couple of lead protagonists, if you will, and allow me to indulge in this, is to share with you maybe a position statement from one of these characters, let's say Rainer Banham, Howard Odum, Jacob von Uxküll, Buckminster Fuller, and then the whole country of Iceland as featuring 5. I didn't know who to credit that one to. We could credit to geology, actually, probably. But so the first one we'll start with is Rainer Banham, and I think a pretty apt place to start, which is to start with the campfire and the campsite. So this is a drawing in Rainer Banham's, I think, much lauded, and many people are revisiting this powerful publication, Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment. And in it, there are 2 drawings that I think are quite interesting. One is this one on the right here, which says these are the environmental conditions around a campfire. That you have these 2 environmental conditions, if we come back to this definition. One is a zone of radiant heat and light, which is within that dotted line, indicating this is a space where you immediately benefit from the campfire. And number 2 is something quite atmospheric, which is the downward trail of warmed air and smoke, so the kind of secondary beneficiaries of this heated source, which is a way to say that this is a space, the campfire is a space, that it itself is an environment, although it might be atmospheric, although it might be only described by its temperature differences, but that it is a space. And then on the left, probably a bit more architectural, is the environmental behavior of a tent, which again has point 1 and point 2, environmental descriptions. 1 says tent membrane deflects wind and excludes rain. Here defining how the tent works to modulate or defend itself against an environment. And then point number 2, that it reflects most radiation, retaining internal heat and excluding solar heat, maintaining some form of privacy. So they're describing a kind of atmospheric air quality to it. So we saw those as interesting, I think a very prescient vision there by Banham for an increasing role that environment plays in architectural design. This was the project we did for the Chicago Biennale. We called it Making Camp, or which is a kind of reference to the idea of setting up a camp. Also domesticated wilderness, this idea that even in the 21st century, that we kind of suburbanize our own wildernesses by setting up camp in them. And increasingly in the realm of technology or advancement in terms of camps and campsite design, this has been mostly taking place in the realm of material innovations, fabric innovations, water wicking fabrics. Like this has been everyone's focus in advancement has been in that. And yet the camp environment is still this kind of quasi-suburban, cul-de-sac-y place where you go and you park right next to your campsite and you're right next to another person who's parking and the latrine's over here and you get your water over there. So this environment has not been, let's say, incredible innovations, kind of NASA-like energy invested into advancement here, and no imagination, no advancement, no progressive thinking about how might we gather in the wilderness today. And also, we were kind of geeking out on how exciting it is when one plans a trip that you get, I think this is from the website, Everything Organized Neatly, like a Tumblr page or something like that. Everything organized neatly. And this is where people going out on excursions would say, these are all the things I'm going to survive on for the next 2 weeks. I don't know how the acoustic guitar factors in, but these would all be laid out as the things that one would survive with. So there's a kind of gear aesthetic, a very product-oriented gear aesthetic to camping culture that we also wanted to celebrate. We didn't want to suppress that and say that it's not there, but find a way to celebrate it. So, and here's the kind of critique of how suburban these formats are. And so the first design question was really about, is there an architectural response or design response at the scale between the tent and the sprawling campsite? Is there something between the two that would offer a new platform for gathering as a collective, whether it's at the scale of a family or many strangers? Mode of practice, in fact, this is not economically sustainable at all, but we tend to, in our approach to these projects, to somehow follow down a kind of rabbit hole of research. So part of it was, okay, well, what's the history of campsites? And a lot of it relates to military developments, and a lot of it relates to really important innovations like the zippered backpack and micro-scaled water treatment and really interesting technologies that have factored into the evolution of camping culture. And we started to just kind of chronicle almost like a kind of tool set of really important product innovations and thinking about how some of these might influence our design. We were trying to, actually the Swiss Army knife is a really interesting to think about as a thing up there, because we were actually looking for a way that our design proposals could operate a little bit in that capacity where it would allow you to not have to bring your tent camping, but that the structures we would make would have within them, tucked into it or embedded in their wall or their floor, they would have camping envelopes and other gadgets and products and ways to manage your water and ways to deal with campfire and food storage and waste storage and things like that. And also one of the ambition for the Biennale too was that we would make these brochures, because every time you go to a campsite, especially even in the US and in Canada, we share this, is that there's this lovely kind of promotional brochure that you get when you first bring your vehicle into the campsite, where they give you this sort of protocols for the campgrounds, and maybe it's a map that has it within it. So we knew we wanted to make each of the 5 campsites we were going to design, we would want to make a little brochure that explains kind of like how you use it. It's like a manual of how that site serves you and what it offers. So we made one about the history of camping, and then we made one for each of the design projects. And we wanted each one of them to be, this was a kind of Canadian self-reflection here, where being the only Canadians in the Biennale that year, we really wanted to convey a sort of wilderness or a wild or a landscape. And so each of the 5 proposals, which are the black figures there, would sit on a single model, but then across that model it would show the gamut of site response. So there was a wetland, which is the one that you see at the bottom of the image. There was a kind of Arctic tundra in the top right-hand corner. There was a kind of forested central area. So it was a bit of I guess, a landscape buffet on the model that was really just meant to show a kind of graduated condition, not meant to be a single site that has all designs on them, but really just to show the kind of range of temperatures and ground conditions and so forth. So the model, we wanted to make, the goal was to make one model that had 5 interventions on it, and then 5 singular drawings, and then 5 of these brochures. So it would have different kind of speeds to interact with it. You could come and just look at the model and engage with that and walk away. You could come, look at the model, take in one of the drawings, walk away with the set of brochures and read them later, or throw them in the garbage. They're made out of newsprint, so that was fine. And so I think just as a way to engage your audience, that was kind of important to us. And we wanted the model to be pretty large. And so maybe I can, this is a base of one of the projects. Maybe I can talk about 1 or 2 of the projects without going too far over my time, but this one was called Closed Loop, which was celebrating the idea of campers' ambition to kind of leave no footprint and to leave no trace and to take what they had with them, back with them. And in particular, we were looking at a challenging site which was on a wetland, and could this closed loop, you can see quite literally, it formally has that property, could it offer new forms of campsite gathering for strangers? So there was like a shared campfire area, and then the periphery of the loop is this thin textile, water wicking textile fabric, just like tents along the periphery edge here. So when a tent was up, it meant it was available. When a tent was tied back down, it meant it was claimed, and you could kind of alter that according to your group. And that there would be, in this inner area, this was using the properties of a wetland as a sort of water cleansing exercise, that we had this terraced artificial wetland here, which would take wastewater from dish cleaning or body washing or any other kinds of things that would take place at a campsite that could be part of that sort of low footprint aesthetic. And then it wouldn't be something that was just done as a feel-good thing, but it would have its own sort of island-like microculture within it. So those were all explained on the brochure that you would get, sort of how it works and what kind of gear you need, and how to know when a campsite was available, and how the water worked. And so that this kind of like manual idea was the only drawings that were produced. All of the drawings were used to illustrate sort of functions and behaviors. And the model had these orange characters on it to just contrast with the white on white. And we did, later on after the Biennale, we did maybe some more rendering collage views of them just to convey it. And we actually did get a couple of bites from Parks Canada, I guess kind of national parks, about this project, and we've had ongoing conversations with them about prototyping a few things. So that was a pleasant moment of going from a kind of experimental proposition with no client and no attachments and hardly any funding to a really interesting phone call and some great meetings, and we toured some Parks Canada people of an exhibition we did later on in Toronto. So this has been sort of an ongoing project. That one in particular had interest. There was another one called Suspend, which was, again, you can see all of these are about collective campsites. So it's not about the singular tent or the singular campground, but different ways of webbing. So this is one that takes the culture, and I wouldn't say we invented this, but the idea of being within the canopy of the trees or suspended between the ground and the canopy. There was another one that looked at a sort of observation tower and had, again, the idea is that you don't bring your tent with you, but that the tent is almost, is literally tucked within the kind of soffit space of the floor above you, and that you can kind of retract it down like a blind, and that this limits the amount of gear you travel with, and that there would be platforms for either planning a day hike or platforms for storing food or gear in a kind of bear-safe way. And and this would come with its own kind of manual on how to use it and maybe what kind of camper type it would privilege. There was the model for that one. Maybe I'll just explain one more. This one was called Off-Grid, which was acknowledging the desire for even when one goes out in the wilderness, even when one is in a remote place, what does one want? Internet, Wi-Fi. You still want to check, back with the office or all of these kinds of cultures. And so this was a way to introduce possibly smaller scale electronified networks. So these are all Wi-Fi induction poles that allow for like a small scale internet connection. They also dealt with the idea of small scale forms of water collection through these inverted cones or solar textiles embedded on the roof. So there are these, this is the equivalent of like the watering hole, or the campfire in a way is now the solar roof. And then individual tents would be within this endless grid. Maybe this is kind of a small scale super studio continuous campsite concept. So very small, it's just a field of poles, field of masts that could be integrated with. And there was one in the Arctic as well that dealt with layer of thermal envelopes, and that one was looking at a kind of tundra environment, so really had to be modulated relative to temperature and climate. So we looked at Rainer Banham. Another person Lowell and I have taken great interest in is the work of Howard Odom, who was a kind of experimental biologist. And he has developed, this is from the 60s and 70s, he's developed a term called energies, which is a language system, or almost you could read it as a sort of pre-grasshopper kind of module or node based representational language system for ecology and small scale systems. So here's one, for example, of a shrimp mariculture pond in Ecuador, just indicating like where does the waste go, how does sun and rain factor into this, what about labor, what about capital, and he's even done, I don't include in this lecture, but he's even done a really interesting one, I believe in the late 70s, looking at the United States, just like taking a whole country and looking at its sort of nodes of ins and outs. Pretty fascinating attempt at looking at a kind of like language finding project, and acknowledging that each action by any small change in this has its own ricochet effects to all of the other factors around it. This is a bit of an old project, so I might do this one a bit more quickly. But this project really takes on board, I think, some of Howard Odom's ideas. And it was a project we started with where it was a classic moment of architects not knowing if there was any architecture in this project yet, but somehow doing it anyway. And it began, this is 2010, we were really interested in water scarcity, challenges around water issues, and where are, relative to their local areas, where are population increases being seen. And of course, Southern California popped up as a sort of interesting overlap between water scarcity issues and population increases. And in doing this kind of drawing and just trying to understand how has water been micromanaged and how has it been diverted and how has it been kind of, I guess, man-manipulated in some ways, what has it created? And we discovered, not only in addition to this strange moment where Phoenix is entirely supported by a diverted Colorado River, which was an interesting side discovery, but we discovered something probably many of you may know already, this area called the Imperial Valley and the Salton Sea, which is near the Mexican border. And it also is a diverted, or really almost kind of accidental valley that came from a dam break, a southern dam break of the Colorado River here, and it diverted into the Imperial Valley, which is a massive area of agriculture. So all of the, if you're buying your salad in New York, your lettuce salad in New York in January, you're getting your lettuce probably from the Imperial Valley. And it has this water body, which is all of the agricultural runoff of those farms. And you can see a kind of green flare, which is essentially an algae bloom coming up at that point. So a point where the kind of salination of that body of water is increased to a very high level. And it had this really amazing culture in the 50s. Marilyn Monroe would go there. Sonny Bono has a strong attachment to that area. It was a kind of Riviera, and it has declined. It has these, on the right, you can see these massive fish die-offs. These are tilapia fish that have all, because of the salination change, have all gone belly up. So this was happening, I think this is from 2007, 2008. So it has these kind of high salination moments that reach a kind of toxic level. So the state of California was looking at these 8 possible solutions, which was very much a kind of engineering-based approach to the problem of like, how can we deal with this as though it is a problem? We need to partition the body of water. We know all of the agricultural runoff will go here. We will make this dry bed here, and we will, spray it with water to tamp it down so it doesn't become a dust storm. And all of these, you can see anywhere between 5.8 billion and 2.3 billion. That was the cheap version. And so these are the design ideas that were put forward. And we thought that was a very kind of starved proposition, missing out maybe on some of the wonderful ideas that might come from the earlier days. Like, could there be a new culture that could emerge out of this body of water the way it was before? I should say, I think that what was interesting about it is that because of the salination, something like the world motorboat speed record was there because the salt would lift the boat out of the water, and so they just like cruise. So this is, people were coming here because of very strange, quirky reasons. But so if on the left is what you have, what it's currently being used for is that the idea is to use the Imperial Valley as a traditional agricultural space and to dump all of the water-based, garbage, liquid garbage of agricultural practices into this body of water. Instead, could there be more of an interchange? Like, could this participate in the same activity of the land-based agriculture, but maybe in a new way? Like, are there other products that it could create that was missing out on? And then what kind of urbanism or what kind of microcultures would that create? So this was the kind of helicopter view. To the south, you have the Imperial Valley. And then we created these 3 different coastal edges. There was a kind of water, freshwater extraction coastal edge. There was a ecological coastal edge, and then there was a recreational coastal edge a bit more over here. And so this was the kind of Howard Odum energies diagram of how, the idea that, let's say, salt, we spoofily claimed that some of the salinated water could be separated between salt and fresh water, and that the salt could be sent to Canada to salt their roads, maybe. And you could get aquaculture from here. And that, so the cast of characters, the kind of elements that would occupy this body of water would work like a kind of modulating device or an equalizer. It was never meant as a fixed urbanism, but one that could be dilated according to need. So let's say if we need to really increase the bird population, you could deploy more of these pools. Or, recreation is going really well right now, so we deploy more of these recreation pools. Or Canada needs more salt, we'll increase the number of pools that will separate out the salinated water to extract salt back from the highly salinated water. Or, kelp or algae farming and other kinds of ideas. So it was meant as a kind of dilatable design, that it would be something that could be managed, and it wasn't meant, it was a critique also of the kind of fixed, kind of hard version that the state was putting forward, as though you put up these hard barriers, like things that you could never change if you then realized it wasn't doing the job you hoped. Whereas this was meant to be something that, okay, we take a few pools offline, we'll put a few more back into place. So a kind of flexible development. And so if previously the first 100 years of the Imperial Valley was really about butter, livestock, field crops, seeds, flowers, fruits, and vegetables, could the next 50 years look at other kind of commodities that would also leverage a kind of economic benefit? And a third idea is this idea called Know Your Umwelt. This is from a Dutch biologist called Jacob van Uxkil. And these are two drawings from a book called A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans. And Lola and I are really struck by these drawings. Grace, partly it's just impressive that a biologist could draw in such a picturesque way. And second, because they're quite powerful in thinking about notions of perception. So I'll try to just quickly explain here. Let's take the one on the right, which is a paired set of drawings. So the top drawing you can see is what Van Uxkil calls surroundings, which is essentially all of the things that are seen. So this is a field according to the perspective of a bee. So a bee, this is literally like the surroundings. So what you see is you see flowers, you see in the background a kind of mountain, you see in the middle ground, maybe there's nothing of interest there, but then the things that's of course of interest are the flowers. So this is everything portrayed almost in equality. On the bottom image, it looks more, I guess, like a kind of video game where the things that are of interest to that species kind of pop up and are more attractive, whereas the things of no interest, like in the background, the entirely black field of the mountain, is not relevant to the bee, not of interest to the bee, and so it's kind of looking at its environment through its own bias and perception, right? Its bias is like, where can pollination take place? So things like that pop out with stars, and if there's and what's interesting in this one is that there's another bee already on this flower, so there's this kind of perception that that one is taken. So could there be other flowers that could be attracted to? So this is what an Umwelt is. An Umwelt is essentially a kind of perception world, not the world as you see it, but the world as you're kind of curating it, or the world that is as things are critical to you. This was so related to Umwelt, very interesting challenge, this project. This was organized by the Royal Institute of British Architects, I believe 2 years ago, and a very interesting call went out to help a very tiny community of, I think, 350 people living on a volcanic island in the north end. Here, this is the community. Here, this is the volcano. I don't think I have to introduce that. And here's where it's located. And this is famously known as the most remote place in the world because of its difficulty to get to it and the difficulty to get anything to it. So if you think about Umwelt relative to Tristan da Cunha, their Umwelt is very small, and their Umwelt is very fragile. So the call went out to, let's go back to the image here. It was a very, very modest call. It asked for retrofits to homes. It asked for alternate uses of landscape, both in the community and in the surrounding. And not a lot grows there. The trees that you see that are growing there are very shrubby, and they're only happening because the buildings are there and they affect the sort of wind patterns, and so seeds are able to deposit differently. But otherwise, it's not easy to grow anything there. And they have a lot of these volcanic rock walls, because of course they have a lot of volcanic rock. So property is kind of defined by rock walls, and they also have this really interesting landscape called the patches, which is where they grow potatoes. So it's a very Irish, Scottish diet here. So these are called the patches, which is outside of the community. So again, a very humbling proposal, a very challenging call that was put out, and we wanted to table something pretty believable and realistic. So quite simply, what we were looking at, the first act was a question about, could you combine what was quite novel and interesting about the soil patch, or the patch network used to grow potatoes, and the kind of pockets, the accidental pockets that were popping up within the community proper. And something that was interesting is that because of the volcano, it was very difficult to create soil that could cultivate anything but potatoes. So what we were offering, and we worked with a soil engineer, a landscape ecologist on this, was to make a series to basically grow soil. So we were trying to find a way that within the community, could we make a series of patches distributed that would offer a wider range of soil type for farming, for cultivating anything other than potatoes. So these are these patches, possibly in like a 5-year phase program, where we did some wind analysis as well, and studied what could we grow here, where could it grow, how would stone walls play into it. So this was on the landscape side, and kind of questions of sustainability and harvest. I think we were the only one that offered, part of the design response was to increase their food diversity. Otherwise, it's pretty much lobsters and potatoes. That's a steady diet for a Tristan da Cunhain. So these were, very modest, very simple, gabion wall construction and other kinds of structures that would facilitate these soil cultivation patches. And there's another view of the community. So that was on the landscape side. And then on the architectural side, at the front end here, so these are all houses. Everything's a house here. There's this little green roof is the post office. This is the lobster packaging facility. This is a good money for them. And there's other small, I think there's a doctor's clinic. This is a very small place. So all of the community functions were concentrated in these shed structures here. So part of the call also asked for, in addition to addressing our landscape challenges, could you address or give us a kind of civic space? So we were looking at, we quite liked their faceted roofs, the pitched roof series. There was a lot of reds and yellows being used. So we wanted to make this a project just about making a kind of expression of civic roofs, almost like long houses, as though they already had these houses. But could you make a series of long houses? And could each one of these long houses come with these patches again? But now they were like civic patches, or they were activity patches. So people could do boat building outside in these with these rock wall. The rock walls were everywhere in this community. So could we introduce these rock walls? So this was this kind of the community's backyard, or the community's kind of courtyard that they would use. And there was this bell tower we introduced, and a civic space for watching the boats coming and go. And then we left the lobster plant the way it was. So this was like a really humbling exercise on a kind of small scale Umwelt perception world of these islanders. And we were looking also at thatch construction and different construction methods for these roofs and the walls. Very, very modest, I think simple basic construction that could work in a quick way. And it was interesting, as we unfortunately we were the runner. We made it through 2 phases. It was a classic moment. You get runner up, and then they went with a local firm. local firm being in London, since it was the RIBA. But we had great interviews with them, and even worked out a proposal that involved a 3-month residency for us in Tristan da Cunha, which was a really kind of life-changing moment to think, are we ready to live on this tiny island with 300 people for 3 months? But we're committed. We drafted the pitch and gave it to them and everything. Really interesting project, but this is the kind of, I think this idea of a kind of immersion in the culture, I'd say is something Lola and I are pretty game for, and maybe that carries out in some other projects as well. Fourth idea, play the world game. And I'm using Buckminster Fuller here to represent this idea. Literally, it was a project called World Game, but it was an interesting approach to it. The idea behind the World Game that Fuller proposed was not about, this is not Risk, where you try to take Kamchatka or something like that. This was an idea of that the game only succeeds when everyone wins. So it was a trading game of trading grains for petroleum, or finding ways to negotiate large-scale resource exchange as a survival strategy. And the game was only won when all players survived, rather than a kind of defeat-based approach. So pretty interesting experiment that Fuller worked on. I think he was working with students at Berkeley in this particular photograph. And it produced really interesting maps, the famous Dymaxion Map. This is a comparison, I think, of global trade routes with bread grains or something like that, looking at different commodities and their possible distribution. I think a very visionary, maybe quasi-utopian global vision, but I think we have, this is mega data. This is large-scale data, which we do benefit from some of this kind of collective data gathering. So the example for this concept of collective survival is a project that's, as Igor said, we participated in the Venice Biennale in 2014, and we used that platform both as a kind of research on the Canadian North, the Arctic, but also as a design experiment, a question about what are alternative approaches to housing, what are alternative approaches to education, and how might architecture respond to those. This project is kind of like the cutting room floor of all of those projects. So we did put forward in the Biennale design projects and made a series of models and had videos on them that tried to make them dynamic in some ways. And then we had all of our footnotes and all of the things that fed into those ideas that we always hoped to make into a book at the Biennale in 2014. But the pile on the floor was in total disarray and needed to be organized and required its own kind of project. So that led to this project, which was only a research project. It was just a collection of our studies, and it kept growing, actually. It got up to about 30 case studies, 15 interviews that we did with experts, and then we wrote a series of essays about architecture in the North, urbanism, mobility, monitoring, and resources. And the title, Many Norths, Spatial Practice in a Polar Territory, we called it Spatial Practice as a way to get out of it just being seen as an architecture book and allow it to be about all ways that people negotiate their space, whatever their practice is. Almost like a kind of thinking of a Michel de Certeau concept of the practice of everyday life, that in a way the Arctic demands a kind of diverse response, not just a singular tool, but maybe a tool thinker that can think diversely. So there are the chapters for those, and I'll just, this is the concept of why it's called Many Norths, which isn't just bad English on my part, but there are different ways in which the North is defined. Like, they're different when one refers to, okay, this is Canada. Sorry, forget basic. Sorry, US is down here. Sorry, Texas is off the map. Sorry about that. But Greenland is up here, if anyone's been there. Alaska, there's Alaska. I think Wasilla's here. No. So, Canada is very similar to Chile in South America, except for oriented horizontally, in the sense that the entire population of Canada is within 50 kilometers of the US border, like pretty much 90% of the population is there. So all of the rest of Canada is resources. We have a lot of those, and very small communities and small towns. And for example, this line, no. This line, no. The Yukon is on the far left, Northwest Territories is in the middle, and then the one that is kind of scraggly up here is called Baffin Island, and all of this area is called Nunavut, which is an Inuit word that means our land. And that became the sort of main focus of the research, was looking at the territory of Nunavut. But there were many different ways in which north was qualified. For example, this is the tree line. No tree grows north of that blue line. So the idea of living north of that blue line is an idea of either importing timber, or you have to bring wood in, or you are not building out of wood, or you're not building out of steel. And there are about 50,000, no, more than that, 55,000 people north of that blue line. And this is also another very important line, which is where continuous permafrost is. So when the ground is permanently frozen, north of that line, the ground is permanently frozen year-round. Of course, that line is changing regularly. So these are different ways to, this is the Arctic Ecozone. This is where you can drive by road. Like if you just got in a car in Toronto, which is barely even, no, not even on the map. If you got in a car and drove, that's as far as you could get by a car without having to shift to an airplane. Yeah, far north. So this was this idea about these many norths. There are many different ways to qualify northernness and what it means. And so I'll just show a couple of quick examples. For example, this is the town of Nunavik. Nunavik, which is closer to Alaska. And they have utilities that there are two different kinds of utilities. There are utilities that had to be above ground because of permafrost. And it's created this really interesting sort of neighborhoodly division between those that get the utilities above ground and those that have to get the utilities by truck. Literally, a truck comes in, empties your tank, or a truck comes in and fills your tank with water. So these are people that are on grid. So naturally, economics is different. Or really interesting devices like the snow fence and how the snow fence works to protect a community. So sorry about the tiny drawing here, but these are little figure grounds of communities, population 1,872, and it has 4 snow fences on this north-west corner that serve as a kind of protective device for the community. So here's an example in the capital city of Iqaluit, actually in Nunavut. You can see it's above the tree line, and so trees were essentially a kind of snow fence, but when you don't have trees, you could go to bed one day and wake up the next day and you can't open your front door because a large dumping of snow has happened overnight. So the snow fence is essentially collective defense against horizontally blown snow. Or foundations, how to make a foundation in the north when you cannot go into permafrost and you have to deal, because what happens if you build directly on the ground, you're warming up the ground and your building will sink into the ground. And so you have to either lift the building up or you have to find a way using, for example, thermosiphons like in the top left corner to extract warm air out of the ground. Or lift the building up to allow for air to pull, wind to pull warm air away from the ground and away from the building. So there's, space frames and thermosiphons and piles that look for rock, which can be down pretty deep, or just looking for permafrost, or you're just looking for stable ground to anchor a building to. Another really interesting cultural moment is the sea lift route. So this is the route by which people in the north get their goods. So they will maybe once or twice a year, they'll make a large order of food to store in a cold storage room in their home. And this boat will come into town, and it's sort of like Christmas. So it's just everybody comes down to the port, and your items are there, and you put them away for another season. So you have to wait, of course, until the water is not frozen anymore, and that distribution is possible. And sometimes these sea cans, as they're called, end up as sort of extensions of the home, either for storage or sometimes people are living in them immediately adjacent to the house. Just showing a couple of, so again, this was like a kind of cutting room floor project from a design project that took on a life of its own and actually became, in my opinion, a bit more interesting to the design projects because it became a cataloging, organizing exercise in spatial ingenuity and how to, and also even like an exercise in understanding indigenous cultural innovations like reading, how to read the safety of the ground, the sea or sea ice, or how to read the scuppering of snow as determining which way the wind was blowing or which way was a safe passage. Really brilliant ways. We tried. I don't think anyone could ever do it justice. Some of this knowledge is only transferable by living it and experiencing it orally, but trying to sort of draw and document some of that. Maybe I'll end this section with one quick example. This one's kind of interesting, which is in northern Quebec, an area called Nunavik, which is a predominantly Inuit territory, again above the road line, above the tree line, which is mussel harvesting along the coast near the Hudson Strait, which leads to the Hudson Bay. So this is the tip of Quebec. There is a practice of going underneath the ice to harvest mussels. And it's a very large tide there. So what essentially happens is the water freezes, the tidal water retracts, and a temporary cave, sometimes for about either 8 hours to 11 hours, appears in the space under the ice, but before the water. So let's say a mussel harvester will arrive by skidoo, will pick at the ice to dig a hole, will turn their sled into a ladder, will climb down into the space at the right time, and temporarily use this tidal retreated space to gather mussels. And time is precious here. It has to be done very quickly and resourcefully. So I think there's a child or a younger person here going with an elder. So this is a kind of knowledge transfer moment where they're teaching them, to how quick to be and when to know, how to know when to leave. So this is a kind of temporary cave after a tidal retreat. And like Lola and I were just marveling at how brilliant it is, how resourceful it is, and wanted to kind of use drawing and documentation as an homage to that. And the last project is called Interact with Your Energy, featuring the country of Iceland. Brilliant country. This is Blue Lagoon. Anyone been to the Blue Lagoon? Okay, yeah. One of the most popular global destinations in the world, which is like the Salton Sea, is actually an environmental accident. It is a geothermal plant. It is the silica-infused kind of residual pond of the geothermal plant that then people discovered the properties it offered in terms of skin treatment and psoriasis and other kinds of issues. And so now it's become a destination, but ultimately it began as an environmental coincidence, a kind of accident. So this very quick competition project we did in 2010 with a good friend, Luis Callejas, landscape architect from Colombia, was called Weather Fields. And it looks at a similar kind of harnessing, if you will, a kind of looking for the collective in energy collection. And it was a competition by the Land Art Generator Initiative. And we were looking in particular wind energy in Abu Dhabi. So first we did was we laid out all of what's happening in wind energy generation today. So this is these are basically like quick cards we made that show, okay, where are innovations happening, knowing that either we want to borrow or retrofit or hack some of these innovations, or knowing what's already been done before. So we arrived at this innovation, we hope, which was to combine a parachute and a kite. So we took the kind of aerial art logic that can happen in the air as the art aspect of this land art generator, and combined, as I mentioned, the parachute and the logic of a kite, and that it would use wind energy to collect and store electrification. So I'll try to explain at least the concept of it. This was our fake patent drawing set we did for this. Never applied for the patent. Don't quote me. So the idea is that through the front face of this parakite, it would bring wind would come into it like kind of gills. And there's something that not invented by us, but something invented by someone else called a wind belt. That essentially, as wind passes over and below that wind belt, it vibrates really rapidly, but without hardly moving. And that micro belt vibration, the kind of tight strapping of that belt across the mouth of these open gills, would be the main source of electrification. And then its shaping, the profiling of the figure was to keep it up in the air. So at this kind of ideal height, which I think was around 150 meters was the ideal height. So, and we proposed maybe there could be a network of them, and that some of them could be tied to each other, so you could get this kind of aerial art. Maybe it could tell you a kind of weather pattern of the day from a distance, and so it would have that quality to it. And we were looking at the different ways in which the environmental phenomenons of Abu Dhabi, which has these amazing storms called shamals, which are intensive sharp storms from the north, where the bay is, and then after the shamals would occur, there would be this fog that would set in. So you'd get these two conditions of intense dust storm and then very quiet kind of foggy air. We also thought it would be interesting that you could interact with your energy, and so that maybe there were different ways to interact with it. So maybe on the left, if you wanted to be an investor, you could have in your house a kind of 24-hour portrayal of the view from one of these parakites, so you'd get this kind of ever-changing landscape painting on your home. Or you could be a tourist where you could come down to the base of it and interact with it in a kind of periscopic way, and you could vicariously see what it sees up there. Or if you were the kind of Richard Branson type, maybe you could actually strap yourself to one of these things and enjoy the view more firsthand. And that there would also be these three different conditions as a kind of fog catcher, or a breeze glider if it was a gentle breeze, or the shamal rider with this sort of intensive winds. So this is maybe the view from being strapped into one of these things back down to the beach, looking at the network. And maybe just at the beginning of one of these shamal storm events. And then possibly the same condition during the fog. So then on the kind of more on the manifesto side, so that would be a one-off condition. But then the idea or the argument was that could all of these petroleum landscapes, these kind of industrial complexes, could there be a way that almost like a transition point, or almost like a welcome virus, could these parakites start to kind of surround themselves and almost like quarantining one of these petroleum scapes as a kind of mode of outmoding them. So that was a kind of bonus aftermath of that. And one final project I'll show is a project we did recently that in Montreal, another kind of interacting with your energy maybe, which was a downtown site. This was a winter festival this past January, a year ago, in the winter city of Montreal. It's often difficult to generate an urban realm. It can be very cold. And so there is a downtown organization called the Quarter Spectacle, or the Spectacle Quarter, that commissions installations in this space. So we got, they usually integrate, they're supposed to integrate sound and light into a single intervention. We got quite interested in making almost a kind of instrument that would be played collectively, so it would encourage collective participation, and there would be something that would come, it would change based upon behavior patterns, based upon intensity, and so we saw it as a kind of wave field, maybe hopefully some form of unknown pleasure, and that it would have things that would come in and out of phase, like a Steve Reich musical piece, that things would come in and out of cycles and would be a kind of ever-evolving, alive landscape. So the idea that it would be locked at certain times because that was required, it would have plays where it could be played formally, where people could be coordinated collectively, or ways in which people could play informally, so they could come, again, in and out of phase with each other. So this was the site plan. So it was essentially about 30 seesaws of different lengths, distributed along a spine, and these are the main frame, the main structure with the fulcrums. It was actually a double fulcrum so that it would have an at-rest moment, so it had two fulcrums in it. It was illuminated, and the illumination would depend on whether you were up or down. So it would always illuminate in the down position, so it would have this sort of oscillating light condition. And also it had we worked with an electronic musician who helped us make it so that it would also have a cycle of note patterns that it would play based upon the up and down condition as well. So this is the sort of rigging of this device. Even this was a fun late 11th hour discovery, is that we had to figure out a way to lock it, and so the handle that was required by the city actually flips back and becomes the locking device, so you can just run a pin through this. So it made it easy for the person maintaining it to every night kind of lock the device. And this is, unfortunately there was no snow on opening. This was always envisioned
about it. You know, what would you say to our students to learn how to become so good at No, but I
yeah.
know that is an important part of what your work is.
Yeah.
You know, how to really tell the story of what you're saying.
Yeah.
You know, in
I think
a graphic way. But
Yeah. It might have a little bit to do. I actually would credit the partnership in this case because it's a classic moment of, let's say Lola will be away and I'll be in the office and I'll be working with somebody and we'll do a pin-up in the space and we'll work up a drawing and I'll be like, yeah, we got it. It's going to be great tomorrow. We'll show it to Lola. And then she comes in and she's kind of like, something's not right. You know, something's missing here. And then it'll be, what? You know, and then we'll refine it back from her critique. And then the same thing will happen in the reverse where I think maybe it's a little bit I would credit the acceptance of the academic environment of always taking critique, you know, just saying like, okay, it's not there yet, and we got to work on this, and also realizing that, and I think the Making Camp project was a moment where I think we got our timing, we got our efficiency down a little bit better on that, other than some other projects, is that it really helped to like plan in advance what we were going to do. We said we're going to do one model and it's going to have 5 models on it and it's going to be the biggest model we've ever made and we're going to do 5 drawings. And then we're like, oh, and we're going to do a newsprint. That came in a bit later. But I think it helped to just realize these are the things, and we're just, so the isometric drawings we did, they went through 25 iterations, even down to trying different colors and different clarities, and like, the landscape on this one is clear, but the landscape on that one is now weak, and I think it was just being able to take a good critique from the people you're working with, and we had good people in the office that could handle that well too. It's never nice to hear you got to go back to the drawing board, but when you see the end product after going back to the drawing board, it's much more satisfying than just thinking like, well, this is all I got time for now, so I'm just going to stick with this. So yeah, that I think it was the partnership really is credited for that. It really helps to be able to take critique from people you work with.
did you do in the office also the many notes, maps and drawings?
We did, maybe to our detriment. We managed to get some funding for that. At one point we were thinking about hiring a graphic designer. We actually talked to Bruce Mao's office, who's in Toronto, and they were kind of a little bit over designing it, and we wanted to undesign it and just say, can we just let the drawings communicate the cartographic conditions, and we want to make these simple, and we just want to use these colors. So that was a moment where it made more sense for us to design it in-house, so we did design the book in-house, and it was, the typography was a bit of a challenge. Akhtar, our publisher, was really useful for that. In fact, I brought one copy with me, but I gave it to Ibai back there, but and I'm very excited. Actually, the book has just come out, so it's one of those things where you work on something for 4 years and nobody has no idea what it is. Occasionally, it makes its way into lectures, and then you're holding the damn thing in your hands, and you're like, yes! You're like, now I can move on to something else. So it's like, yeah, it feels nice. And I'm looking for, there's my one copy that I brought with me. It's nice and thick. It's 480 pages, so it was. But I think it's $40. I don't know. That's their problem. But the funding of it was really Canada Council for the Arts, Graham Foundation gave a bit. So it was like over 4 years we would try to gather a bit of funds, and that made it possible to do it in-house. Otherwise, it would have tanked us. Thank you. That's very nice.
I think you mentioned a lot how your office kind of gets stuck into the research aspect, and I'm wondering both in how you kind of are guided through that research, but also how you balance outputting the research in a way that's actually digestible, both for yourself and for the audience, I suppose. Or when do you find that you need to give yourself a cutoff point from getting too far into something? Or do you find that it's at the same, it's happening parallel with your design? Does that make sense?
Totally. That's a great question. I don't have any magic answers other than that it's a pretty gut, this is a horrible answer, it's a pretty gut response, but part of it has to do again with the collaboration and saying, I mean, it's very easy to wake up one Wednesday and be like, oh my, what the hell, we're down this hole right now, and where is it going? And then just to reflect on how we got there, and sometimes there was a step just a few days ago or a few steps back where you're like, that's enough, we can work with something like that. I would say also something that's been very effective is we've had great people that we bring into the studio, whether it's for a 1-year internship or 6 months, or sometimes people have been with us for 2.5, 3 years. Those people, it's a non-hierarchy. I mean, when you're only 4 or 6 people, you know, it's not useful to have a hierarchy there. And so people are pretty willing to speak their minds, and I think it actually helps. And usually we're all mostly working on one project. Sometimes there's 2 projects in the office. So if everybody's invested in the same thing, we're all willing to say, like, you know, that's not going to work, or this is ridiculous, or how are we going to do that? It's a pretty open, honest, studio-based environment. I would say also the kind of spitballing of ideas at that point of not knowing whether you should keep doing the research or whether it's time to project something and propose something. Just the kind of like rambling, like a team lunch, or just a quick pin-up, and everyone kind of brainstorming, well, we could do this, and maybe that's the approach, was very helpful. And then we'd, you know, sketch out ideas. So it's usually just the hard way. I can't remember, I saw this, somebody was talking about this the other day. It was a really brilliant quote, and I meant to write it down and I didn't. But it said something about like, oh, I know what it was. You know, on Netflix, there's a new documentary that follows different designers. The very first one, which I think is like a cartoonist or something like that, they were asking him, like, how do you come up with your ideas? And he's like, I have to go to work. He's like, the only way I could get anything done is I actually just have to sit down and do the hard work. Like it was a quote of somebody else saying, like, the idea of waiting for the epiphany moment is ridiculous. Like, anyone who's waiting for that moment is missing out. Like, you just have to sit down and go through 5 different ideas and evaluate them and crit each one and distill it down to your approach. I think unfortunately, it's more of that. Just lay out the bad, and there will be bad ideas, and you got to, like, that's the thing, is like, to accept bad ideas is the best way to make progress, rather than waiting only for the good ones.
Maybe on that, there were,
I got a question. Thanks for coming, like, first of all. It was a great order lecture. A lot of people like present their work, but they don't present it in a structured way. I was wondering why you chose to stay in academics.
I'm pretty interested in the agency of the architect. I'm pretty interested in what designers can be and do, and not always seeing it only as a client-based medium. And fortunately, the luxury of academia offers platform possibly to pursue both kinds of identities. I'm really interested in, like, for example, another book series I do called Bracket is about giving voice to emerging designers, giving voice to emerging thinkers, whether they're recent graduates or others. And so I really like making books. I like doing events. I like dialogues. I think that architecture is more than just only the building. And it seemed that the best way I could pay my rent was to combine that with teaching. So far that seems to be working, but I would gladly take in my life career doing 1 or 2 buildings that are of great interest rather than 30 or 40 that are of moderate interest. So I'm happy to hold out for maybe things that I'm proud of doing rather than doing things to continue to pay my studio space rent. So I'm happy to stay small until more interesting work comes along, and teaching facilitates that kind of selectivity. So I feel like I owe it to academia to hold that ideal upon myself. Yeah?
can you talk about the role of cartography?
Well, maybe it was kind of in the first slide about architecture and environment. Lola and I are both very interested and very influenced by landscape architecture and urban design and planning, and we think that they've got some really smart approaches to understanding site and context. And although as architects we often think of, where's the property line is the conception of site, it'd be nice if architects thought a little bit more about the larger scale impacts of design, whether it's where their materials are coming from, how it influences small things like bird migration, or how it's impacting a social aspects of a neighborhood. So I think the cartography is really a way of critiquing architects as kind of stopping at the property line and thinking of all scales of map making as a way of understanding a site and a context. So we hold that to be of great interest as a kind of like also a kind of form of getting to know a place that's always hard to get to know without stomping the ground every day kind of thing.
Hi. I have a question about your practice. It seems like you derive a lot of inspiration from the human ingenuity that comes from placing people in these extreme kind of environments. And I was wondering if you think that there's anywhere that humans should like not occupy, like the island, for example.
Oh. No, I don't. It's so interesting. I forget about, and I'm not insinuating you're saying this, but I've had many people, I've made about 13 or 14 trips to above the tree line to the Arctic. I've been to northern, Russia, I've been to Greenland, I've been to Alaska, I've been to northern Norway, I've been to all of the territories of Canada. And sometimes when I come back and I'm talking to even casual friends, they say kind of like, well, why are they even living up there? I don't think you're saying this question, but why are they even living up there? And I have to say, I actually, the question of why do people live in the Canadian North, it actually doesn't understand the kind of the indigenous spirit, which is they were there first. Like it's incredible how people have adapted to life in the cold. Like everything from making their clothing out of animal skin to like even their architecture. Like there's not just the igloo, which people still make, but there was also other kinds of animal skin tents and whalebone structures and really interesting innovations that are done in the face of great extremity. And so, I mean, I don't think there's any place that people should not inhabit. In fact, I think, I mean, it's an urbanizing world, so we're never going to fight this, but I think we privilege kind of urbanized culture as being the dominant culture more often than we should. And I mean, I was speaking with Ibai this morning about this, but I don't know if you've heard Rem Koolhaas's latest craze is he's really interested in the countryside, like Office of Metropolitan Architecture. We're going to look at the countryside now. And, and well, he's done everything else, right? So, but I get that, and he's a very smart and ingenious person. It is true. There's a lot to learn from the ingenuity of those kind of off the grid and those that are not as receptive to urbanizing or not part of the kind of great urban migrations. And there's some fascinating research looking at urban migrations patterns and in the informal city and all that stuff, all valid. But equally, there's really interesting lessons to take from indigenous cultures. So I think I've been humbled by that and new notions maybe of vernacular, like what is vernacular in our kind of globalized world where everything's steel and glass and Miesian looking. What is vernacular architecture today? Thank you.
Thank you.